I stood in my empty kitchen on Christmas morning, still holding the phone where my daughter-in-law had just told me I was no longer welcome in my son's home, while upstairs in their master bedroom hung the mortgage papers I'd been secretly paying for 3 years. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman who'd just uninvited me from Christmas dinner was sleeping under a roof I'd been keeping over her head. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Mattie Roberts, and at 72 years old, I thought I'd seen every shade of family betrayal possible. I was wrong. What happened over the next 6 months didn't just change Christmas forever, it rewrote the entire definition of what family means to me. I've been a widow for 8 years now, ever since my husband Frank passed from a heart attack that took him faster than we ever imagined possible. Frank and I had built a good life together. He was a contractor. I worked as a bookkeeper for the local credit union, and together we'd saved every penny we could for retirement and for our only child, Mark. We weren't wealthy by any stretch, but we were comfortable. And more importantly, we were planners. When Frank died, he left me with a paid-off house, a decent life insurance policy, and investment accounts that had grown steadily over our 43 years of marriage. The grief nearly broke me, but the financial security Frank had worked so hard to provide meant I could mourn without worrying about losing our home or struggling to pay bills. It was Frank's final gift to me. Peace of mind. Marcus had always been a good son, the kind of boy who called his mother every Sunday and remembered her birthday without prompting. When he married Stephanie 5 years ago, I was genuinely happy for him. She was pretty, ambitious, worked in marketing for a tech startup, and seemed to make Marcus smile in a way I hadn't seen since his college days. I welcomed her into our family with open arms, hoping for the daughter I'd never had. The first few years of their marriage were smooth enough. Stephanie was polite during holiday gatherings, thanked me appropriately for gifts, and even asked for my pot roast recipe once, though I suspected she never actually made it. There were small things that gave me pause: the way she'd check her phone during family conversations, how she'd redirect Marcus when he started telling childhood stories I enjoyed hearing, the subtle way she'd change the subject whenever I mentioned Frank or our old tradition. But I told myself these were normal adjustments, the natural process of a young wife establishing her own family unit. Then came the house hunt. Marcus and Stephanie had been renting a small apartment downtown since their wedding, and by their 3rd year of marriage, they'd started looking for a home to buy. I was thrilled. It felt like the next natural step toward the grandchildren I'd been quietly hoping for. They'd drive around neighborhoods on weekends, come back excited about open houses, and Marcus would call me with updates about mortgage pre-approvals and inspection schedules. But the updates became less frequent, and when they did call, Marcus sounded increasingly frustrated. The market was competitive, interest rates were climbing, and homes in the neighborhoods they wanted were consistently out of their price range. Stephanie had her heart set on a particular area, Willowbrook Heights, where the homes were newer, the lots were larger, and the property taxes reflected the prestige of the zip code. One Sunday evening, Marcus called sounding defeated. They'd put in offers on 3 different houses, and been outbid each time. Their pre-approval amount wasn't enough for the neighborhood Stephanie wanted, and the houses they could afford weren't meeting her standards. I could hear the strain in his voice, and it broke my heart. That's when I made the decision that would eventually lead to this Christmas morning phone call. I offered to help with the down payment. Not just a small contribution, a substantial gift that would allow them to qualify for the mortgage they needed for a home in Stephanie's preferred neighborhood. I had the money. Frank and I had always planned to help Marcus when he was ready to buy a home, and seeing my son stressed about something I could easily solve felt wrong. Marcus was hesitant at first. He'd inherited Frank's pride about accepting help, even from family, but I insisted, explaining that this was exactly what Frank would have wanted, that helping them achieve this milestone was one of the greatest joys I could imagine in my retirement years. After several conversations, Marcus agreed, and I wrote a check for $60,000 toward their down payment on a beautiful colonial in Willowbrook Heights. The gratitude was overwhelming, at least from Marcus. He hugged me with tears in his eyes the day we went to the bank together. Stephanie thanked me too, but there was something different in her appreciation. It felt more like relief than genuine gratitude, as if I'd simply fulfilled an obligation rather than made a generous gift. But that was just the beginning of my financial involvement in their lives. 6 months after they moved into the house, Marcus called with another problem. His company had gone through layoffs, and while he'd kept his job, his hours had been cut significantly. Their mortgage payment, combined with the higher utilities and property taxes of their new neighborhood, was stretching their budget beyond its limits. They were looking at potentially having to sell the house they'd just bought, a prospect that devastated both of them. I couldn't bear the thought of them losing the home I'd helped them buy, especially when I had the means to prevent it. So I made another offer. I would supplement their mortgage payments until Marcus's work situation stabilized. It was meant to be temporary, just a few months of help during a difficult period. Those few months turned into 3 years. What started as emergency assistance became a regular arrangement. Every month I'd transfer $1,500 into their checking account to cover the difference between what they could afford and what their mortgage actually cost. Marcus was embarrassed about it, always promising that the next promotion or the next job opportunity would allow them to take over the full payment themselves. But those opportunities never seemed to materialize, or when they did, there was always another expense that prevented them from resuming full financial responsibility for their home. Stephanie, meanwhile, had grown comfortable with the arrangement. She never mentioned the payments directly, but I noticed how easily she'd talk about home improvements they were planning, vacation photos they'd post on social media, or expensive purchases that seemed inconsistent with a budget that couldn't cover their basic housing costs. It was as if my monthly contributions had simply become an expected part of their financial landscape. I didn't mind, at least, not initially. I had more money than I needed for my simple lifestyle, and helping my son felt like a meaningful way to use Frank's legacy. I told myself that this was what family did for each other, that Frank would be proud of how I was supporting Marcus during a challenging time in his life. But as the arrangement continued year after year, I began to notice changes in how Marcus and Stephanie treated me. The weekly phone calls became less frequent. Holiday visits felt more obligatory than joyful. When I'd suggest family activities or traditions, Stephanie would often have scheduling conflicts or alternative plans. I started to feel less like a beloved mother and grandmother in waiting, and more like a distant relative they tolerated out of duty. The breaking point came this past November, 3 weeks before Christmas. I'd been looking forward to the holidays for months. Frank and I had always hosted Christmas dinner, and after his death, Marcus and Stephanie had continued the tradition of coming to my house for the celebration. It was the one day each year when their home still felt like the center of our family, when I could cook Frank's favorite recipes and share stories about Christmases past and dreams for future ones. I'd already bought gifts, planned the menu, and even splurged on new Christmas china to make the day extra special. When I called Stephanie to confirm the timing and ask if there was anything special she wanted me to prepare, her response caught me completely off guard. "Actually, Mattie, we've decided to do Christmas differently this year," she said, her tone carefully casual. "Marcus and I are hosting at our place, and we're keeping it small, just immediate family." I was confused. "But I am immediate family," I said, laughing a little because I thought she might be joking. There was a pause. "We're really trying to establish our own traditions as a couple," she continued. "You understand, right? It's nothing personal." Nothing personal. Those words echoed in my head as I tried to process what she was actually saying. My son and daughter-in-law, whose mortgage I'd been paying for 3 years, whose down payment I'd provided, whose financial stability I'd been ensuring month after month, were uninviting me from Christmas because they wanted to establish their own traditions. "Does Marcus feel this way too?" I asked, my voice smaller than I'd intended. "We've talked about it and we're on the same page," Stephanie replied. "We'll see you soon though. Maybe we can do lunch the week after Christmas, or something." The week after Christmas, lunch. As if I were an acquaintance they were trying to squeeze into their busy social calendar, rather than the mother who'd sacrificed to give them the life they were now living. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen for what felt like hours, staring at the Christmas china I'd bought for a celebration that was no longer happening. The silence in my house felt different than it ever had before, not peaceful. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. But I thought about Frank, about how he'd always said that family was the most important investment you could make, and I wondered what he'd think about the return we were getting on this particular investment. That night, I kept replaying the conversation, trying to understand how I'd gone from essential family member to unwelcome outsider. I thought about all the times I'd prioritized their needs over my own comfort, all the months I'd transferred money I could have used for travel, or home improvements, or simply saved for my own future security. I thought about how effortlessly Stephanie had delivered the news, as if disinviting your mother-in-law from Christmas was just another item to check off her holiday to-do list. But more than hurt, I felt a growing sense of clarity. If Marcus and Stephanie wanted to establish their independence, if they wanted to create boundaries around their immediate family, then perhaps it was time for me to respect those boundaries completely. If I wasn't family enough to be included in their Christmas celebration, then maybe I wasn't family enough to be included in their mortgage payments either. The next morning, I called my financial advisor, Robert Chen, who'd been managing my accounts since Frank's death. Robert had always been professional but warm, treating me with the kind of respect that comes from understanding both loss and the responsibility of managing inherited wealth wisely. "Mattie," he said when his secretary put me through, "how are you? How can I help you today?" "Robert, I need to review my monthly automatic transfers," I said. "Specifically the one going to Marcus and Stephanie." There was a pause. Robert knew about the mortgage assistance. He'd helped me set up the automatic transfer system to ensure the payments were consistent and reliable. "Is there a problem with the amount or the timing?" he asked. "I want to stop it," I said simply. Another pause. "Are you sure? Has something happened with Marcus?" I could hear the concern in his voice. Robert had been managing money for families long enough to recognize the signs of relationships in crisis. "Something has happened," I confirmed. "But I'd rather not get into the details right now. I just need to know what's involved in stopping those transfers." Robert walked me through the process. Since the transfers were coming from my money market account, I had complete control over them. I could stop them immediately, or I could set them to discontinue after a certain date if I wanted to provide notice. The choice was entirely mine. "If you don't mind me asking," Robert said carefully, "have you discussed this with Marcus? These kinds of financial changes can sometimes create family tensions if they're not communicated clearly." I appreciated his diplomatic way of asking whether I was making an emotional decision I might later regret. "I'll handle the family communication," I told him. "Right now I just want to understand my options." After we hung up, I spent the rest of the day thinking. I wasn't acting out of spite, though I'd be lying if I said Stephanie's dismissal hadn't stung. This was about respect and boundaries. If they wanted to be independent, they needed to actually be independent. If they wanted to make decisions about family inclusion without consulting the person who'd been financially supporting them, then they needed to be prepared to live with the consequences of those decisions. By evening, I'd made up my mind. I called Robert back and told him to stop the monthly transfers effective immediately. No notice period. No gradual reduction. If Marcus and Stephanie wanted to establish their own traditions and their own definition of immediate family, they could do it with their own money. But I didn't call Marcus that night. I wanted to see how long it would take for them to notice, how long it would take for them to reach out when their account balance didn't magically increase by $1,500 at the beginning of December. I was curious whether the same people who could so casually exclude me from Christmas would be equally casual about the absence of my financial support. The answer was 6 days. Marcus called on a Thursday evening, his voice tight with panic. "Mom, I think there might be a problem with the bank transfer. The payment didn't come through this week, and when I called the bank, they said there wasn't any pending transfer scheduled." I let him explain the situation as if I didn't already know exactly what had happened. He'd clearly spent considerable time on the phone with his bank, trying to troubleshoot what he assumed was a technical error. The idea that I might have intentionally stopped the payments hadn't even occurred to him. "It's not a banking error, Marcus," I said when he finished describing his conversations with customer service representatives. "I stopped the transfers." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long that I wondered if we'd been disconnected. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice confused and small. "You stopped them. Why?" This was the conversation I'd been both dreading and anticipating. "Because Stephanie made it very clear that I'm not immediate family anymore," I said, keeping my tone as steady as possible. "And if I'm not immediate family, then your housing costs aren't my immediate responsibility." "Mom, what are you talking about? What does Stephanie have to do with the mortgage payment?" For a moment I wondered if Stephanie hadn't told him about our conversation, if she'd made the decision to exclude me from Christmas without even consulting him. But then I remembered her words. "We've talked about it and we're on the same page." "Marcus, Stephanie called me 3 weeks ago to tell me that I'm not welcome at Christmas because you want to establish your own traditions with immediate family only," I explained. "If that's the kind of independence you're looking for, then I think it's time for you to be fully independent." Another long silence. When Marcus spoke again, his voice was strained. "Mom, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Stephanie didn't mean—" "Marcus," I interrupted gently, "there was no misunderstanding. Stephanie was very clear about what she meant, and I'm being very clear now too. I respect your decision to prioritize your marriage and your own family unit, but respect goes both ways." I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, could almost feel him trying to process the implications of what I was saying. The mortgage payment was due in less than 2 weeks. Without my contribution, they wouldn't have enough to cover it. "We can't afford the house without your help," he said finally, and the admission seemed to pain him. "I know," I replied. "That's been true for 3 years, but somehow it never stopped you from making plans that didn't include me." The conversation ended with Marcus promising to talk to Stephanie and call me back. I knew what that meant. They needed to figure out how to fix this situation, how to repair whatever damage had been done so that the money would start flowing again. I also knew that their motivation wasn't primarily about repairing our relationship or recognizing how they'd hurt me. Their motivation was financial survival, but for the first time in months, I didn't feel like the desperate one in this dynamic. I didn't feel like the person begging for inclusion or acceptance. I had something they needed, and they'd have to figure out how to repair the relationship if they wanted it back. That night, I slept better than I had since Stephanie's phone call. I wasn't happy about the conflict, wasn't celebrating the fact that my son was stressed about money, but I was finally taking control of a situation where I'd been allowing myself to be taken advantage of, and there was relief in that decision. The next morning, I woke up and made coffee in my quiet kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd planned Christmas dinners that were no longer happening. I looked at the Christmas china still sitting in boxes on my counter and made another decision. I was going to return. If I was going to be spending Christmas alone, I didn't need new dishes to remind me of the celebration I'd been excluded from. But first I was going to wait and see what Marcus and Stephanie decided to do next. The ball was in their court now, and for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't the one scrambling to solve their problems. I was curious to see how they'd solve this one themselves. The investigation phase of my newfound independence began not with any grand plan, but with simple curiosity about what I'd actually been funding all these years. I'd been writing checks and authorizing transfers for so long that I'd stopped paying attention to the detail. Now, with the monthly payments stopped and Marcus scrambling to figure out his next move, I found myself wondering exactly what kind of lifestyle my $1,500 per month had been supporting. I started with their social media account. I'd never been much of a Facebook person myself, but Stephanie posted regularly, and her privacy settings were loose enough that I could see most of her updates without being connected as a friend. What I found there made my stomach turn in ways I hadn't expected. The photos told a story of a couple living well beyond the means they'd claimed to have. Just in the past 6 months, there were pictures from a long weekend in Napa Valley, complete with wine tastings at vineyards that charged hundreds of dollars per person. A few weeks later, Stephanie had posted photos of a new designer handbag she'd treated herself to, after a particularly stressful work week. The bag was clearly expensive, the kind of purchase that costs more than some people's monthly car payment. There were dinner photos from restaurants I recognized as the most expensive establishments in the city, the kind of places Frank and I had visited maybe twice in our entire marriage, and only for very special occasions. Stephanie and Marcus seemed to eat at these places regularly, based on the frequency of the posts and the casual way she tagged the locations. But what really caught my attention were the home improvement photos. Over the past year, they'd apparently renovated their kitchen, adding granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, and custom cabinetry that must have cost tens of thousands of dollars. Their living room had been redecorated with furniture that looked like it came from high-end showrooms rather than the budget stores where young couples typically shop. The basement had been finished into an entertainment area complete with a bar, big screen television, and leather seating that probably cost more than my car. I sat in my own modest living room, looking around at the furniture Frank and I had bought piece by piece over decades of careful budgeting, and tried to reconcile what I was seeing with the story I'd been told about their financial struggle. These weren't people who couldn't afford their mortgage payment. These were people who'd chosen to spend money on luxuries, while letting someone else cover their basic housing costs. The more I scrolled through Stephanie's posts, the clearer the pattern became. Every few months, there was a new major purchase or expensive experience, always presented as something they'd worked hard for, or deserved. Never any mention of the fact that their ability to afford these indulgences was directly connected to the fact that they weren't actually paying their full mortgage. I decided to dig deeper, and that's when I remembered something Marcus had mentioned months ago about setting up online banking for easier money management. He'd asked for my help navigating the website when he was trying to link our accounts for the automatic transfer. During that process, I'd seen him enter his login credentials, and knowing my son's habits with passwords, I had a pretty good idea what they might be. Marcus had always been terrible with passwords, using the same simple combinations for everything from his email to his old video game account. When he was younger, it had been his birthday followed by his middle initial. As an adult, he'd upgraded to slightly more complex versions, but still followed predictable patterns. I felt a twinge of guilt about what I was considering, but I rationalized it by reminding myself that my money had been flowing into these accounts for 3 years. I had a right to understand how it was being used, especially now that I was being excluded from family decisions, while still being expected to fund family expenses. It took me 3 tries to guess correctly, but eventually I accessed their online banking portal. What I found there was worse than anything I'd seen on social media. Their checking account showed a pattern of spending that was breathtaking in its recklessness. The monthly mortgage payment I'd been covering was indeed $1,500, but their total monthly expenses were nearly double their combined income. They were using credit cards to bridge the gap, running up balances that they'd pay down periodically, with what appeared to be cash advances or balance transfers from other cards, but it was the timing of their major purchases that really told the story. The kitchen renovation had been financed just 2 months after Marcus had called me, worried about potential layoffs at his company. The Napa Valley trip had been booked the same week he'd told me they were struggling to afford their new property taxes. The pattern was consistent and deliberate. Every time they'd claimed financial hardship to justify continuing my mortgage assistance, they'd simultaneously been spending money on luxury items and experience. I printed out 6 months of bank statements, highlighting the dates and amounts that corresponded to our conversations about their financial struggles. The evidence was damning, but more than that, it was heartbreaking. My son had been lying to me, month after month, about their actual financial situation, while I'd been sacrificing my own financial security to help them maintain a lifestyle they couldn't afford. But the real revelation came when I found the credit card statement. They had 7 different cards, all with significant balances, and several had been opened in just the past year. The minimum payments alone were more than $400 per month. Money that was going toward financing purchases they'd made while claiming they couldn't afford basic housing costs. I spent hours going through the statements, categorizing their expenses and trying to understand the scope of what I'd been inadvertently enabling: restaurants, clothing, electronics, home improvements, travel, spa treatments for Stephanie, golf equipment for Marcus, subscriptions to services I'd never heard of, Monthly charges for everything from premium cable packages to expensive gym memberships. These weren't people living paycheck to paycheck. These were people living like they had unlimited income while using my money to ensure they never had to face the consequences of their spending choices. The most painful discovery came in the form of text message records that were included in their online account summary for a shared family plan. Most of the messages were routine, but I found a conversation thread between Marcus and Stephanie from just a few weeks earlier that made everything crystal clear. Stephanie had texted, "Did you ask your mom about increasing the payment amount? The new car payment is going to be tight." Marcus had responded, "Not yet. She's been weird lately about family stuff. Maybe wait until after Christmas." Stephanie, "She's not going anywhere. She needs us more than we need her at this point." Marcus, "Don't say stuff like that. But yeah, she's not going to cut us off. She's too invested in being needed." The casual cruelty of that exchange hit me harder than anything else I'd discovered. They weren't just taking my money. They were actively strategizing about how to get more of it while simultaneously planning to exclude me from family gatherings. Stephanie's assessment was particularly brutal. "She needs us more than we need her at this point." I realized that's exactly how they saw our relationship, not as a family bond based on love and mutual respect, but as a dependency where I needed them for emotional connection more than they needed my financial support. They'd calculated that I was too lonely, too desperate for family contact to risk cutting off the money even if they treated me poorly. They'd been wrong about that calculation, but the fact that they'd made it at all revealed how completely they'd misunderstood both my character and my financial position. I spent the rest of that week documenting everything I'd found. I created spreadsheets showing their actual spending versus their claimed financial hardship. I printed emails where Marcus had described their budget struggles alongside bank records showing luxury purchases made on the same day. I compiled a folder of evidence that told the complete story of how my generosity had been not just taken for granted, but actively exploited. But I didn't confront them with this information immediately. Instead, I decided to wait and see how they handled the absence of my financial support. I wanted to understand whether they'd approach the situation with honesty and accountability, or whether they'd continue the pattern of manipulation and deception that had apparently been going on for years. The answer came faster than I'd expected. 3 days after Marcus's panicked phone call about the missing transfers, Stephanie called me directly. She'd never called me directly before. All our communication had always gone through Mark. The fact that she was reaching out personally told me how serious they considered their situation to be. "Mattie," she said, her voice artificially bright, "I think we need to clear the air about this Christmas thing. I'm worried there's been a huge misunderstanding." I didn't respond immediately, curious to see how she'd try to reframe the conversation we'd had just weeks earlier. "When I said immediate family, I didn't mean to exclude you," she continued. "I meant immediate as in the people living in the house, but of course your family. You're Marcus's mother. You're the most important family we have." The transparency of her manipulation was almost insulting. She was obviously trying to walk back her previous position now that there were financial consequences attached to it. But what struck me most was how smoothly she lied, how easily she contradicted what she'd said before, while acting as if the contradiction had never happened. "Stephanie," I said calmly, "you were very clear about what you meant. You said you wanted to establish your own traditions as a couple, and that I wasn't part of your immediate family. There wasn't any ambiguity in that conversation. But I was stressed about the holidays," she said, her voice taking on a pleading quality. "You know how crazy Christmas planning can be. I wasn't thinking clearly. Of course we want you there. Marcus has been so upset about this whole thing." I doubted Marcus had been upset about anything other than the missing mortgage payment. But I didn't say that. Instead I asked, "So you're saying you've changed your mind about Christmas?" "Yes. Absolutely. We would love to have you join us at our house. I'll make your favorite dessert and we can do all the traditional things you and Marcus used to do together." The offer was everything I'd wanted to hear 3 weeks earlier, but now it felt hollow and calculated. She wasn't inviting me because she wanted me there. She was inviting me because she needed my money to continue flowing. The warmth in her voice was so obviously manufactured that it made me feel sad rather than angry. "That's very kind of you, Stephanie," I said, but I think your first instinct was probably right. You and Marcus should establish your own tradition. You're adults and you don't need me hovering around your holidays. There was a pause and I could hear the confusion in her voice when she responded. But we want you there. Really, it wouldn't be Christmas without you. It's sweet of you to say that, I replied. But I've already made other plans. I'm going to spend Christmas with some friends from the credit union. We're doing a potluck dinner and gift exchange. It should be lovely. This was actually true. When word had gotten around my former workplace that I was going to be alone for Christmas, 3 of my old colleagues had invited me to join their celebration. I'd initially declined, still hoping the situation with Marcus and Stephanie might resolve itself. But now I was looking forward to spending the holiday with people who genuinely wanted my company. Other plans? Stephanie's voice was getting tighter. But Marcus will be so disappointed. He's been talking about making this right with you. Then Marcus is welcome to call me himself, I said. But Stephanie, I want to be clear about something. The decision about Christmas and the decision about the mortgage payments are separate issues. Even if we resolve the holiday situation, I'm not planning to resume the financial arrangement we had before. The silence that followed was so long I wondered if she'd hung up on me. When she finally spoke, the artificial sweetness was gone from her voice. You're punishing us financially because of a misunderstanding about dinner plans. I'm not punishing anyone, I said. I'm simply recognizing that you and Marcus are capable adults who want to make your own decisions without consulting me. That's your right, and I respect it. But it also means you need to be financially independent enough to live with the consequences of those decisions. Mattie, we can't afford the house without your help. You know that. I do know that, I agreed. I've known it for 3 years. But somehow that knowledge never translated into being included in decisions that affected our family relationships. This is ridiculous, Stephanie said, and now her voice was sharp with frustration. You're being petty and vindictive over something that was never meant to hurt you. Stephanie, I said, keeping my voice steady, I'm being consistent. If you want to be independent enough to make decisions about family inclusion without consulting me, then you need to be independent enough to make decisions about family finances without relying on me. That's not the same thing at all. It's exactly the same thing, I said. You can't be independent when it suits you and dependent when it benefits you. You have to choose. The conversation ended with Stephanie saying she needed to discuss the situation with Marcus and would call me back. I knew what that meant. They needed to figure out how to get the money flowing again without having to actually acknowledge how they'd treated me or make any real changes to their behavior. But I was curious about something else now. I wanted to understand exactly how precarious their financial situation really was without my assistance, so I decided to keep monitoring their accounts, just to see how long they could maintain their current lifestyle once they realized the mortgage money wasn't coming back. What I discovered over the next few days was illuminating. Within 48 hours of my conversation with Stephanie, they'd made several large cash advances from their credit cards, apparently trying to bridge the gap until they could convince me to resume payment. But the cash advance fees and interest rates on those transactions were astronomical, and I could see that this strategy would only work for a month or 2 at most. More interesting was how quickly they began cutting expenses once they realized their situation might be permanent. The expensive restaurant charges stopped appearing immediately. Stephanie's regular spa appointments disappeared from their scheduled payments. Marcus canceled his golf club membership and several subscription services. But even with these cuts, their basic monthly expenses were still more than their income. The house payment, property taxes, insurance, utilities, minimum credit card payments, and other fixed costs added up to more than Marcus's salary could cover, even with Stephanie's income included. They'd built a lifestyle that required external financial support to be sustainable, and they'd apparently never considered what would happen if that support disappeared. I realized that my monthly contribution hadn't just been helping them, it had been enabling them to avoid making the hard financial decisions that most adults have to make. Instead of choosing between the expensive house and the expensive lifestyle, they'd been able to have both because I'd been subsidizing their choices. Now they were going to have to choose, and based on what I was seeing in their spending patterns, they weren't prepared for that reality. The final piece of my investigation came when I decided to research the actual value of their house. I'd helped them buy it 3 years earlier, but I'd never really looked into whether it had appreciated in value or what their options might be if they needed to sell. What I found was that the house had increased in value significantly since their purchase. The neighborhood had continued to develop, property values had risen with the overall market, and their home was now worth nearly $200,000 more than they'd paid for it. After accounting for the remaining mortgage balance, they had substantial equity in the property. This meant they weren't trapped in an unaffordable situation without option. They could sell the house, pay off the mortgage, and use the remaining equity as a down payment on something more modest that fit within their actual budget. It would mean leaving their prestigious neighborhood and downsizing their lifestyle, but it would also mean genuine financial independence. The fact that they weren't considering this option told me everything I needed to know about their priorities. They didn't want financial independence if it meant giving up the lifestyle they'd grown accustomed to. They wanted to maintain their current standard of living while having someone else bear the financial responsibility for making it possible. I closed my laptop after completing this research and sat in my quiet living room, processing what I'd learned. The situation was worse than I'd initially thought, but it was also clearer. This wasn't a temporary financial struggle that warranted family assistance. This was a deliberate choice to live beyond their means while manipulating me into covering the difference. More than that, it was a fundamental disrespect for both my financial sacrifice and my emotional needs. They'd been taking my money while excluding me from their lives, treating me like a banking institution rather than a family member. But now I had complete information about their situation, and I was prepared for whatever conversation came next. I knew exactly what they could afford, what they owed, what their options were, and what they'd been spending my money on instead of building genuine financial stability. The ball was still in their court, but now I was playing with a full understanding of the game. Marcus finally called me on a Tuesday evening, 10 days after our last conversation. I could hear the strain in his voice before he even said hello, the kind of exhaustion that comes from sleepless nights spent calculating impossible math. I knew they'd been scrambling to find solutions, probably calling in favors, looking into loans, maybe even considering the unthinkable option of selling their showcase home. "Mom," he said, and there was something different in his voice. Not just stress, but a kind of defeat I'd never heard from my son before. "We need to talk." "Of course, sweetheart," I said, settling into my favorite chair with the cordless phone. I'd been expecting this call, but I was curious to see how he'd approach the conversation. Would he come with honesty and accountability, or would there be more manipulation and half-truths? "Can I come over, like tonight? This is too important for a phone conversation." I agreed, and within an hour Marcus was sitting across from me in my living room, looking older than his 32 years. His hair was disheveled, his usually neat appearance rumpled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too many nights spent staring at bank balances and mortgage statements. "Mom, I need to be completely honest with you about everything," he began, and those words gave me the first real hope I'd felt since this whole situation started. "I've been lying to you about our finances, and I've been lying to myself about what that means." I didn't interrupt, just waited for him to continue. I could see he'd prepared for this conversation, maybe even rehearsed what he wanted to say. "When you first started helping us with the house payment, it really was because of the layoffs at work," he said. "But those layoffs ended 18 months ago. I got my full hours back, and then I got a promotion last year that actually put me ahead of where I was before the cuts happened." This aligned with what I'd discovered during my investigation, but hearing him admit it was still jarring. "So why did you continue accepting my help?" I asked. Marcus ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was struggling with difficult homework or trying to explain a broken window or a poor report card. "Because it felt good to finally have money," he said. "Growing up, we were always careful about spending. You and Dad were always talking about budgets and saving and making sure we could afford things before we bought them, and that was fine. It was responsible. But sometimes I felt like we were missing out on things other families had." I felt a pang of hurt at this revelation. Frank and I had been careful with money, but it was because we'd wanted to provide security for our family, not because we'd wanted to deprive Marcus of anything important. "When I got married and we started looking at houses, Stephanie's friends were all buying in neighborhoods we couldn't afford," Marcus continued. They were going on vacations we couldn't take, buying cars we couldn't finance, eating at restaurants that were way outside our budget. And when you offered to help with the down payment, it felt like finally we could live the way other people our age were living. But the down payment was a one-time gift, I said. It wasn't meant to subsidize an ongoing lifestyle. I know that, Marcus said, quickly. But when the layoffs happened and you offered to help with the mortgage payments, it solved more problems than just the house payment. Suddenly we had enough money to do things we'd never been able to afford. And once you start living at a certain level, it's really hard to go back. This was the heart of it. I realized, it wasn't that they couldn't afford their house. It was that they couldn't afford their house and the lifestyle they wanted to live while owning it. My monthly contribution hadn't just covered a mortgage payment, it had freed up money for them to spend on wants instead of just needs. Marcus, I said gently, when you called me about the layoffs, when you told me you were worried about losing the house, I thought you were asking for help with survival, not with luxury. He nodded, tears forming in his eyes. I know, and I knew it was wrong to keep taking the money once things got better at work, but I kept telling myself it was temporary. I kept thinking we'd figure out how to manage without it, but we just kept spending more instead of planning for the day when you wouldn't be helping us anymore. And Stephanie, how does she feel about all this? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him choosing his words carefully. Stephanie thinks you're being unfair, he said finally. She thinks family should help family, and that you're punishing us for wanting to be independent. Is that what you think too? I think I've been an idiot, Marcus said, and the bluntness of his admission surprised me. I think I've been taking advantage of your generosity while telling myself I deserved it, and I think I've been letting my wife treat my mother poorly because it was easier than dealing with the conflict. This was more honesty than I'd gotten from Marcus in years, but I could sense there was more he needed to say. The thing is, Mom, we really can't afford the house without your help. Even with both our incomes, even with my promotion, we've built up so much credit card debt, trying to maintain our lifestyle that we can barely make the minimum payments, let alone the full mortgage. How much debt? I asked, though I already knew the answer from my investigation. About $43,000 across 7 cards, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And that's after we consolidated some of it last year. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but inside I was calculating the full scope of what my monthly assistance had been enabled. If they'd been using my mortgage help to free up money for credit card spending, then I'd essentially been financing their debt accumulation for 3 years. Marcus, why didn't you tell me about the debt when I was helping with the house payments? Because I was embarrassed, he said, and because I knew if you understood how we were really spending money, you'd stop helping us. At least he was being honest now. So what's your plan? I asked. You can't expect me to resume the mortgage payments when you've been lying to me about why you needed them. I know, Marcus said. I know I don't deserve your help anymore. But Mom, if we can't figure something out, we're going to lose the house. And if we lose the house, with our credit situation, we might not be able to qualify for anything else. We could end up having to move in with Stephanie's parents, or find some tiny apartment, and Stephanie says she can't live like that. There it was. The real issue wasn't that they couldn't afford housing, it was that they couldn't afford the housing they wanted while maintaining the lifestyle they'd grown accustomed to. And rather than making the hard choices necessary to live within their means, they wanted me to continue subsidizing their choices. Marcus, I said, I've done some research on your house. It's worth about $200,000 more now than when you bought it. If you sold it, you'd have enough equity to pay off the mortgage and the credit cards, and still have money left over for a down payment on something more affordable. Marcus looked stricken. But Mom, that house is our dream home. It's in the perfect neighborhood, and we've put so much work into it. We can't just give up on it. You're not giving up on it, I said. You're making a responsible financial decision to live within your means. That's what adults do when they can't afford their dream. Stephanie would never agree to sell, Marcus said. She loves that house, and all her friends live in that area. She says moving to a cheaper neighborhood would feel like failure. I realized then that this conversation wasn't really about money or houses, or even about our family relation. It was about Marcus being caught between his wife's expectations and his family's values, and not having the strength to choose his own path. Marcus, I said, what do you want? Not what Stephanie wants, not what you think I want to hear, but what do you actually want for your life? He was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red with unshed tears. "I want to stop lying to you," he said. "I want to stop feeling guilty every time I see our credit card statements. I want to stop worrying about money all the time, even though we seem to have plenty. I want to go back to being the kind of person who pays his own bills and doesn't take advantage of his mother's kindness." "Those are all things you can choose to do," I said. "But you have to actually choose them, not just want them." "I know, but I also don't want to lose my marriage. And I don't know if Stephanie will stay with me if we have to give up the lifestyle we've been living." This broke my heart in a way that all the financial manipulation hadn't. My son was trapped in a marriage where his worth was apparently tied to his ability to provide luxury. And he was so afraid of losing that conditional love that he was willing to compromise his integrity and exploit his family to maintain it. "Marcus," I said carefully, "if Stephanie would leave you because you can't afford to live beyond your means, then maybe the question isn't how to keep affording the lifestyle. Maybe the question is whether you're in the right relationship." Marcus flinched as if I'd slapped him. "Mom, I love her. I know she can be difficult sometimes, but she's my wife." "I'm not saying you don't love her," I said. "I'm saying that love shouldn't come with financial requirement. Your father and I were happiest in the early years when we could barely afford our apartment, because we were building something together based on partnership, not on maintaining appearances." We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us processing the weight of what had been said. Finally, Marcus spoke again. "What would it take for you to consider helping us again?" I'd been dreading this question because I knew my answer would hurt him, but I also knew it was necessary. "Complete honesty about your finances, full transparency about your spending, your debt and your income, a realistic budget that doesn't require external support to be sustainable, and most importantly, respect for me as a family member, not just as a financial resource." What does that last part mean specifically? It means I don't get excluded from family decisions or family gatherings while being expected to fund family expenses. I said, "It means you don't take my money while your wife treats me like an inconvenience. It means if you want family support, you include family in your life, in meaningful ways." Marcus nodded slowly. "That sounds fair. More than fair, actually. And it also means you need to make a real plan for financial independence." I continued, "If I help you again, it needs to be with the clear understanding that the help is temporary, and that you're using the time to create a sustainable situation, not just to continue living beyond your means. So you might consider helping us if we meet those conditions." I looked at my son, seeing both the little boy I'd raised and the man he'd become, with all his flaws and struggles and potential for growth. "Marcus, I love you more than anything in this world," I said. "I would do almost anything to help you succeed and be happy, but I won't enable you to fail. If you want my help, you have to be willing to accept the kind of help that actually helps. Not just the kind that makes things easier in the short term." "What would that look like?" "It would look like you and Stephanie sitting down with me and creating a real budget based on your actual income," I said. "It would look like you developing a plan to pay off your credit card debt within a reasonable time frame. It would look like you making hard decisions about what kind of housing and lifestyle you can actually afford. And it would look like you treating me like family, not like a bank." Marcus was quiet for another long moment. "I need to talk to Stephanie about all this. I understand. But Marcus, I want you to understand something important. These conditions aren't negotiable. I'm not going to debate or compromise on being treated with respect. And I'm not going to enable financial irresponsibility anymore. So when you talk to Stephanie, make sure she understands that these are the only terms under which I'll consider resuming any kind of financial assistance. What if she won't agree? Then you'll have to decide what's more important to you," I said. "Your relationship with your mother and your financial integrity, or maintaining a lifestyle you can't afford with someone who doesn't respect your family." Marcus left that night with a lot to think about, and I could see the weight of the decisions ahead of him in his posture as he walked to his car. I felt sorry for him, but I also felt hopeful. For the first time in our conversations about this situation, He'd been completely honest with me. He'd acknowledged his mistakes, taken responsibility for his choices, and seemed genuinely interested in finding a real solution rather than just a temporary fix. But I also knew that the hardest part was still ahead. Whatever decisions Marcus made about his marriage, his lifestyle, and his priorities would determine not just whether our financial arrangement resumed, but whether our relationship as mother and son could be over the next few days. I continued monitoring their accounts, curious to see how they'd respond to our conversation. What I saw was encouraging in some ways, and concerning in others. The encouraging part was that they'd stopped using their credit cards almost entirely. The expensive restaurant charges, spa treatments, and other luxury purchases had disappeared completely from their transaction history. It appeared that Marcus had taken our conversation seriously and was trying to implement some immediate changes. The concerning part was that they were now making their mortgage payment by taking cash advances from multiple credit cards, rotating between different cards to maximize the amount they could borrow and minimize the immediate impact on any single account. This was a strategy that might work for a month or two, but the fees and interest rates would quickly make it unsustainable. I realized they were buying time, probably hoping that if they could demonstrate some financial responsibility and repair our relationship, I might be willing to resume the mortgage assistance before their credit card strategy collapsed entirely. But I was also beginning to understand that this situation was about more than just money or family dynamics. It was about enabling Marcus to make the choice between the kind of man he wanted to be and the kind of man his circumstances were pressuring him to become. If he chose to prioritize his integrity and his family relationships over maintaining an unsustainable lifestyle, then we could rebuild our relationship on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. If he chose to prioritize the lifestyle and the marriage that required financial deception to maintain, then at least we'd both be clear about where we stood. Either way, I was done being taken advantage of. I was done being treated like a financial resource, rather than a family member. And I was done enabling choices that were ultimately harmful to everyone involved. The next move was Marcus and Stephanie's to make, but for the first time in 3 years, I was confident that whatever decision they made would be based on complete information and clear consequence. The games were over, and the real choices were finally beginning. The confrontation I'd been anticipating came 3 days later, but not in the way I'd expected. Instead of a phone call or a visit from Marcus, Stephanie showed up at my front door at 8 o'clock on a Friday morning, clearly having taken time off work to address what she obviously considered an urgent situation. She stood on my porch in a crisp navy blazer and perfectly applied makeup, looking like she was heading to a business meeting rather than a family discussion. I invited her in, though something about her demeanor made me wary. There was an energy about her that felt calculated and aggressive, like she'd prepared for a negotiation rather than a conversation. She declined my offer of coffee and sat rigidly on the edge of my sofa, her purse clutched in her lap like armor. "Mattie," she began without preamble, "Marcus told me about your conversation the other night, and I think there are some things we need to clear up." The use of clear up rather than discuss or work through immediately put me on guard. This wasn't going to be an apology or an attempt at reconciliation. This was going to be Stephanie's version of damage control. "I'm listening," I said, settling into my chair and keeping my voice neutral. "First of all, I want you to understand that Marcus is devastated about this whole situation," she said. "He's barely sleeping, he's distracted at work, and he's constantly worried about disappointing you. This financial pressure you've put on us is affecting his health and our marriage." I blinked, processing the fact that she'd somehow managed to position me as the person causing problems in their relationship. "Stephanie, I haven't put any financial pressure on you. I've simply stopped providing financial assistance that you were never entitled to in the first place." "But you did it without warning," she said, her voice taking on a tone that suggested I'd committed some sort of breach of contract. "You just cut us off completely without giving us time to adjust or make other arrangements. That's not how family treats family." The irony of her lecturing me about how family treats family was almost breathtaking, but I kept my expression calm. "I stopped the payments after you told me I wasn't welcome at Christmas because I'm not immediate family. It seemed like you were already making decisions about family boundaries, so I responded accordingly. Stephanie waved her hand dismissively. That was just about holiday logistics. You're making way too big a deal out of a simple scheduling issue. It wasn't a scheduling issue, Stephanie. You specifically told me you wanted to establish your own traditions with immediate family only, and that I wasn't part of that group. But you're taking it so personally, she said, and there was genuine frustration in her voice, as if my emotional response to being excluded was somehow unreasonable. Couples need space to build their own traditions. That doesn't mean we don't love you or want you in our lives. Apparently it means exactly that, I said, at least according to the conversation we had. Stephanie shifted tactics, leaning forward slightly and adopting what I recognized as her professional persuasion voice. Look, I'll admit that maybe I didn't communicate clearly about Christmas. Maybe I should have explained better what we were trying to do, but this financial retaliation is completely out of proportion to what happened. It's not retaliation, I said. It's a natural consequence. If you want to be independent enough to make family decisions without consulting me, then you need to be independent enough to pay your own bills. But we can't pay our own bills, Stephanie said, and for the first time there was a crack in her composed facade. You know we can't afford the house without help. You're essentially forcing us to lose our home over a misunderstanding about dinner plans. I studied her face, noting how she'd framed the entire situation. In her version of events, I was an unreasonable person causing financial hardship over a trivial social slight. There was no acknowledgement of the pattern of taking my money while excluding me from decisions, no recognition of the lies about their financial situation, and no understanding of why I might feel hurt or disrespected. Stephanie, I said carefully, Marcus and I had a very honest conversation about your actual financial situation. He told me about the credit card debt, about the fact that his job situation improved over a year ago, and about how you've been spending the money that was freed up by my mortgage assistance. Stephanie's expression hardened. So now you're monitoring our spend. That's incredibly invasive, Mattie. I'm not monitoring anything, I said, though technically that wasn't entirely true. Marcus volunteered that information because he realized that our financial arrangement was based on false premises. False premises, Stephanie repeated, her voice sharp. We needed help with the mortgage. You provided help with the mortgage. I don't see how that's false. You needed help maintaining a lifestyle you couldn't afford, I corrected. The mortgage was just one piece of a much larger financial picture that you weren't honest about. Stephanie stood up abruptly and began pacing in front of my coffee table. This is ridiculous. Every family helps each other financially. My parents helped us with our wedding. They've helped with vacation costs. They bought us furniture when we first got married. Family support is normal. Family support is normal, I agreed. Being lied to about why that support is needed isn't normal. Being excluded from family decisions while being expected to fund family expenses isn't normal. We never excluded you from anything important, Stephanie protested. Christmas isn't important. It's one dinner, Mattie, one meal. You're acting like we banned you from our lives forever. I realized then that we were operating from completely different frameworks of what family relationships should look like. To Stephanie, family was a resource to be managed and utilized when beneficial. Emotional connections were secondary to practical arrangements. To me, family was a web of mutual care and respect where financial support flowed naturally from emotional bonds. Stephanie, I said, let me ask you something direct. Do you actually want me in your life, or do you just want my financial support? The question seemed to catch her off guard. She stopped pacing and looked at me with what appeared to be genuine confusion. That's not a fair question. It's not either or. Actually, it is, because the way you've been treating me suggests that my value to your family is primarily financial. When you need money, I'm essential. When you want to make family decisions, I'm not even consulted. That's not true, Stephanie said, but her voice lacked conviction. Then explain to me how someone who's been paying $1,500 of your mortgage every month for 3 years doesn't merit a conversation before being disinvited from Christmas. Stephanie sat back down, her composure finally cracking. Look, I know I handled the Christmas thing badly. I was stressed about hosting and cooking and making everything perfect, and I just thought it would be easier with fewer people to worry about. Easier for who? For me, she admitted. For Marcus. For everyone. How was it easier for Marcus to exclude his mother from Christmas? Because then he didn't have to worry about managing both of our expectations and making sure everyone was happy. This admission revealed more than Stephanie probably intended. She saw my presence as a burden that Marcus had to manage rather than a joy he wanted to share. In her mind, including me created stress for Marcus rather than happiness. Stephanie, do you understand why that perspective might be hurtful to me? She was quiet for a moment. I guess I never thought about it from your perspective. I was just trying to make things less complicated. But you made things more complicated by excluding someone who's been financially supporting your household for years. I didn't think you'd react this way, she said, and there was something almost petulant in her tone. I thought you'd understand that we needed space to be a couple. What I understand is that you wanted the benefits of my financial support without the responsibilities of treating me like family. Stephanie's face flushed. That's not fair. We do treat you like family. When do you treat me like family? The question hung in the air between us, and I could see Stephanie struggling to come up with examples. Finally she said, we invite you to things, we include you in holidays. You invited me to things when it was convenient for you, and you uninvited me when it wasn't. And you included me in holidays, until you decided you didn't want to anymore. But we're inviting you back now, Stephanie said, as if this solved everything. We want you at Christmas. We want you to be part of our traditions. Because you need the money, I said bluntly. Not because you actually want my company. That's not true, Stephanie protested, but her voice was weak. Stephanie, be honest with me. If I had never given you any money, if I were just Marcus's mother with no financial resources to offer, would you still want me at Christmas dinner? The length of her pause was answer enough, but when she finally spoke, her words confirmed what I already knew. I don't know, she said quietly. Maybe, but that's not the situation we're in. No, it isn't, I agreed, but it could be. If you want to find out whether you actually enjoy my company, or just my financial contributions, all you have to do is build a life you can afford without my help. Stephanie's composure finally broke completely. We can't afford our life without your help. You know that. Why are you being so cruel about this? I'm not being cruel, I said. I'm being honest. You've built a lifestyle that requires my financial support to maintain, and then you've treated me as if my role in your lives is optional. Those two things are incompatible. So what do you want from us? Stephanie asked, and I could hear desperation creeping into her voice. I want what I told Marcus I wanted: complete honesty about your finances, a realistic budget that doesn't require external support, and respect for me as a family member rather than just a financial resource. But those conditions are impossible to meet, Stephanie said. We can't afford our lifestyle without help, and we can't just completely change how we live. Then you can't have my help, I said simply. Stephanie stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her processing the reality that her attempts at persuasion weren't working. Finally she tried a different approach. What if we compromised? She asked. What if we included you in more decisions, and made you feel more valued, but you continued helping with the mortgage? You could be more involved in our lives, and we could maintain our financial stability. Stephanie, that's not a compromise. That's you agreeing to tolerate my presence in exchange for my money. That's exactly the dynamic I'm trying to change. But you're asking us to give up everything we've worked for, she said, and now there were tears in her eyes. Our home, our neighborhood, our friends, our entire life. How is that fair? I'm asking you to live within your means, I said. The same thing every other adult has to do. But we had an arrangement, Stephanie said. You can't just change the terms without warning. You changed the terms when you decided I wasn't family enough to be included in Christmas, I said. I'm just responding to the new terms you established. That's not the same thing at all. It's exactly the same thing, I said. You made a unilateral decision about our family relationship. Now I'm making a unilateral decision about our financial relationship. Stephanie stood up again, her professional composure completely gone now. This is insane. You're destroying Marcus's life over a holiday dinner. I'm not destroying anything, I said. I'm simply refusing to continue enabling a lifestyle you can't afford while being treated as if my feelings and my role in this family don't matter. But what about Marcus? She asked. He's caught in the middle of this. He loves you, and he loves me, and now he has to choose between his mother and his wife. No, he doesn't, I said. He has to choose between financial responsibility and financial irresponsibility. He has to choose between honesty and deception. He has to choose between respecting his family and taking advantage of his family. Those choices have nothing to do with choosing between people. But you're making it impossible for him to have both. Stephanie said. Stephanie, Marcus can have both his mother and his wife, but he can't have both financial independence and financial dependence. He can't have both honesty and deception. He can't have both respect and exploitation. Those are the actual choices he needs to make. Stephanie grabbed her purse and headed toward the door. This conversation is pointless. You've already made up your mind to punish us. And nothing I say is going to change that. I haven't made up my mind about anything, I said, following her to the door. I've set clear conditions for resuming any financial assistance. If you and Marcus choose to meet those conditions, we can rebuild our relationship. If you choose not to meet them, that's your decision to make. Those conditions are impossible, Stephanie said, her hand on the doorknob. They're not impossible, I said. They're just incompatible with the lifestyle you want to maintain. Stephanie turned back to look at me one more time. You're going to regret this, Mattie. When Marcus and I lose our house and have to start over with nothing, when our marriage falls apart because of the financial stress, when you realize that you chose pride over family, you're going to regret this decision. But I'll regret enabling your financial irresponsibility and accepting disrespectful treatment even more. After Stephanie left, I sat in my quiet living room and thought about the conversation we'd just had. It had confirmed everything I'd suspected about her motivations and her understanding of family relationships. She genuinely didn't understand why I might want emotional connection to accompany financial support. She saw my conditions as unreasonable demands rather than basic expectations for respectful treatment. But more than that, she'd revealed that she had no intention of making the changes necessary for genuine financial independence. Her idea of a solution was for me to continue funding their lifestyle, while they made minimal adjustments to include me more in their social activities. She wanted to buy my tolerance of their behavior, not actually change their behavior. Over the next few days, I continued monitoring their financial activity, partly out of curiosity and partly to understand how serious their situation was becoming. What I saw was increasingly desperate financial maneuvering that couldn't be sustained much longer. They'd maxed out 3 of their credit cards with cash advances to cover the mortgage and other expenses. They'd opened 2 new credit cards in the past week, probably using promotional balance transfer offers to move debt around and create temporary breathing room. But even with these strategies, their minimum monthly payments were now consuming more than half of their combined income. More telling was what they weren't spending money on anymore. All discretionary spending had stopped completely. No restaurants, no entertainment, no shopping, no service. They were living like people in genuine financial crisis, which in some ways they now were, even though the crisis was entirely of their own making. I realized that they probably had another few weeks before their financial house of cards collapsed entirely. The question was whether they'd use that time to make realistic plans for sustainable living, or whether they'd spend it trying to find ways to manipulate me into resuming the mortgage payments. Based on my conversation with Stephanie, I suspected it would be the latter. She'd made it clear that she had no intention of accepting a lifestyle reduction, and that she saw our entire conflict as my problem to solve, rather than their behavior to change. But I also knew that Marcus was struggling with the situation in ways that Stephanie wasn't. His conscience was engaged in a way that hers didn't seem to be. He understood that they'd been living beyond their means, and taking advantage of my generosity. The question was whether that understanding would translate into the courage to make different choices, even if those choices weren't what his wife wanted. I found myself hoping that Marcus would find the strength to choose financial responsibility and family integrity over maintaining an unsustainable lifestyle. But I also knew that I couldn't make that choice for him. All I could do was maintain my boundaries and wait to see what decisions he made when the consequences of his financial situation became unavoidable. The phone rang late that Friday evening, and I knew before answering that it would be Mark. His voice was exhausted and defeated in a way that broke my heart. "Mom," he said, "we need to talk about selling the house." Those 8 words told me everything I needed to know about how his conversation with Stephanie had gone, and what decision he'd finally made about the kind of life he wanted to live. Marcus arrived at my house the next morning looking like he hadn't slept in days. His usually neat appearance was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, and there was a hollowness in his eyes that spoke of someone who'd spent the night wrestling with impossible decisions. He carried a manila folder thick with documents, and I could see his hands trembling slightly as he set it down on my kitchen table. "I brought everything," he said without preamble. "Bank statements, credit card bills, the mortgage paperwork, our tax returns for the last 3 years. Everything you asked for. Complete transparency." I poured him coffee and sat down across from him, noting how he couldn't quite meet my eyes. The folder between us felt like evidence in a trial, which in many ways it was. "Before we look at any of this," I said gently, "I need to know something. Is this what you want to do? Or is this what you think I want you to do?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. "I've been thinking about that all night," he said finally, "and I realized that for the past 3 years, I haven't been making decisions based on what I want. I've been making decisions based on what seemed easiest in the moment, what would avoid conflict, what would let me keep things the way they were without having to face hard truth." He looked up at me then, and I saw something in his expression that reminded me of the boy he'd been, the one who'd always tried to do the right thing, even when it was difficult. "This is what I want to do," he said. "I want to be honest with you. I want to live within my means. I want to be the kind of man Dad would be proud of, and the kind of son you deserve." "What about Stephanie? How does she feel about all this?" Marcus's face tightened. "Stephanie thinks I'm making a huge mistake. She thinks you're being manipulative and controlling, and that I'm letting you destroy our marriage out of some misplaced sense of guilt." "And what do you think?" "I think my marriage was built on a foundation of financial lies and taking advantage of family," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I think if it can't survive honesty and responsibility, then maybe it wasn't as strong as I thought it was." We spent the next 2 hours going through every document in that folder. The picture that emerged was even worse than I'd discovered during my own investigation. The credit card debt wasn't $43,000 as Marcus had initially told me. It was closer to $58,000 when all the cards and lines of credit were included. They'd been making minimum payments by rotating cash advances between different accounts, a strategy that was rapidly approaching its mathematical limits. Their monthly expenses, when everything was included, exceeded their income by nearly $2,000. Even if they'd been paying the full mortgage themselves, they still would have been spending more than they earned by $500 per month. My contribution hadn't just been covering their housing costs, it had been enabling a lifestyle that was unsustainable even with 2 good income. "Marcus," I said, looking at the final calculations, "even if you sell the house and pay off all this debt, you're going to need to make some serious changes to how you spend money. This isn't just about housing costs." "I know," he said. "I've been looking at apartments online, trying to figure out what we can actually afford. It's humbling." "What kind of places are you looking at?" 2-bedroom apartments in neighborhoods I never thought we'd live in," Marcus said with a sad smile. "Places where the rent is less than half our current mortgage payment. Places without granite countertops or walk-in closets, or any of the things Stephanie says she can't live without." "How is she handling that reality?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "She's not handling it well. She keeps saying there has to be another way, that we just need to be more creative about finding solutions. She's been calling her parents, seeing if they can help. She's looked into refinancing options, even though our credit situation makes that impossible. She's basically doing everything except accepting that we need to live differently, and if she can't accept it, then I guess I'll find out whether my marriage can survive my wife losing respect for me, because I can't afford the lifestyle she wants." The sadness in his voice broke my heart. I realized that Marcus had been living with this pressure for years, trying to be someone he wasn't financially capable of being, taking money from his mother to maintain a facade that was slowly destroying his sense of himself. "Marcus," I said, I want you to understand something. The fact that you can't afford a luxury lifestyle doesn't make you a failure as a husband or as a man. The fact that you're willing to live within your means and be honest about your situation makes you exactly the kind of man your father was. Tears formed in Marcus's eyes. I miss him so much right now. I keep thinking about what he'd say about all this, about how disappointed he'd be in the choices I've made. Your father would be proud of what you're doing right now, I said firmly. He'd be proud that you're taking responsibility, that you're being honest, that you're choosing integrity over appearances. These are the values he tried to teach you, and you're finally choosing to live by them, even if it costs me my marriage, especially if it costs you your marriage, I said, because a marriage that can't survive honesty and responsibility isn't worth preserving. We talked for another hour about practical matters. The house would need to be listed soon if they were going to avoid foreclosure. With the equity they'd built up, they'd be able to pay off the mortgage, eliminate all their credit card debt, and still have enough left over for a security deposit and first month's rent on an apartment. It wouldn't be comfortable, but it would be sustainable. Marcus would need to have difficult conversations with Stephanie about their new budget, about the kind of lifestyle they could actually afford, about what their relationship would look like without the external financial support that had been propping it up for years. What if she leaves? Marcus asked as we were finishing up. Then you'll know that her love was conditional on your ability to provide luxury, I said, and you'll be free to find someone whose love is based on who you are rather than what you can afford to give them. That's a terrifying thought. It's also a liberating one, I said. Marcus, you're 32 years old. If this marriage doesn't work out, you have plenty of time to build a life with someone who shares your values, someone who would rather struggle together than live in luxury that requires deceiving family. Marcus left that day with a clear plan and what seemed like a sense of relief, despite the uncertainty ahead of him. For the first time in our conversations about this situation, he looked like himself again, like the man I'd raised rather than the person he'd been trying to become to satisfy his wife's expectations. Over the next week, I watched as Marcus began implementing the changes we'd discussed. The house went on the market with a realtor who specialized in quick sales. Marcus opened a new checking account that Stephanie didn't have access to, where he could deposit his paycheck and manage their true budget without interference. He canceled several subscription services and memberships that had been draining their finances without providing real value. But I also watched as the tension in their marriage reached a breaking point. Through my continued monitoring of their shared accounts, I could see that Stephanie was still trying to maintain their previous spending patterns, even as Marcus was trying to implement financial discipline. She'd opened 2 new credit cards in her name only, apparently planning to continue their lifestyle on her own if Marcus wouldn't cooperate. The confrontation came 10 days after our kitchen table conversation. Marcus called me at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, his voice shaky and strained. "Mom, Stephanie moved out today. She's staying with her parents, and she says she's not coming back until I come to my senses about our financial situation." I felt my heart sink, not because I was surprised, but because I knew how much this was hurting my son. "How are you doing with all this?" "I'm scared," Marcus admitted, "and sad, and relieved, and guilty about being relieved. I keep thinking maybe I should have tried harder to find a compromise. Maybe I should have been more patient with her adjustment to our new situation." "Marcus, you gave her every opportunity to be part of the solution. She chose to see the problem as your unwillingness to find more money, rather than your family's unwillingness to live within your means." "I know, but it still hurts." "Of course it hurts. You loved her. You married her believing you'd build a life together. It's natural to grieve when you realize that the person you married isn't willing to build the kind of life you can actually sustain." "She left a note," Marcus said. "She said I've chosen my mother over my wife, and that she won't compete with your control over our finances." "What do you think about that?" "I think she's wrong. I think I've chosen honesty over deception, and responsibility over recklessness. The fact that you support those choices doesn't make this about choosing between people. That's a very mature way to look at it." "I don't feel mature," Marcus said with a bitter laugh. "I feel like a failure. I feel like I couldn't provide for my wife the way a husband should." "Marcus, providing for your wife doesn't mean going into debt to finance luxury. it doesn't mean lying to your family to subsidize a lifestyle you can't afford. Providing for your wife means building a sustainable life together, based on what you can actually earn and afford. Stephanie doesn't see it that way. Then Stephanie has a fundamental misunderstanding of what financial security actually means. I said, real security comes from living within your means, not from spending beyond them, while someone else covers the difference. The house sold within 3 weeks, for slightly more than the asking price. Marcus was able to pay off the mortgage, eliminate all their credit card debt, and put the remaining money into savings for his fresh start. He found a modest 2-bedroom apartment in a middle-class neighborhood, the kind of place where young couples typically live while they're building their careers and saving for their future. Stephanie filed for divorce 2 months later, citing irreconcilable differences. She'd apparently decided that Marcus's inability to maintain their previous lifestyle represented a fundamental incompatibility that couldn't be overcome. According to Marcus, she'd found a new boyfriend within weeks of moving out, someone who worked in finance and could afford the kind of life she felt she deserved. Does that hurt? I asked Marcus when he told me about Stephanie's new relationship. Less than I thought it would, he said. It mostly just confirms that she was never really committed to building a life with me. She was committed to a lifestyle, and when I couldn't provide that lifestyle anymore, she found someone who could. How do you feel about that? Sad for the time I wasted trying to be someone I wasn't. Sad for the damage I did to our relationship while I was lying to you and taking advantage of your generosity, but mostly just grateful that I figured it out before I wasted any more years living beyond my means and compromising my value. Marcus's divorce was finalized 6 months after Stephanie moved out. She didn't ask for alimony, apparently confident that her new relationship would provide the financial security she was looking for. Marcus kept the savings from the house sale, which gave him a solid emergency fund and the beginning of a real financial foundation. But more than the practical changes I watched as Marcus rediscovered himself during this period. Without the pressure of maintaining an expensive lifestyle and managing Stephanie's expectations, he seemed to relax into the person he'd always been underneath the stress and deception. He started calling me regularly again, not because he needed money but because he enjoyed our conversation. He began pursuing hobbies he'd abandoned during his marriage, rediscovering interests that Stephanie had considered too modest or time-consuming. He even started dating again, eventually, though his approach was completely different than it had been when he'd met Stephanie. He was upfront about his financial situation, his values, and his commitment to living within his means. He wasn't trying to impress anyone with expensive restaurants or costly activities. He was looking for someone who shared his values and was interested in building something real together. A year after his divorce was finalized, Marcus met Sarah, a teacher who lived in his new neighborhood. She drove a 10-year-old Honda, brought her lunch to work every day, and thought the most romantic date was a picnic in the park with homemade sandwiches. When Marcus told me about her, his voice had a lightness I hadn't heard since before his marriage to Stephanie. She thinks it's impressive that I own my car outright and have money in savings, Marcus told me with a laugh. She says most guys our age are still trying to figure out how to pay their credit card bills. How does it feel to be with someone who appreciates financial responsibility instead of resenting it? Like I can finally breathe, Marcus. Like I don't have to pretend to be someone I'm not, or apologize for not being able to afford things that don't really matter anyway. Sarah and I met 6 months into their relationship and I knew immediately that this was different. She was genuinely interested in hearing stories about Marcus's childhood. She asked thoughtful questions about my work at the credit union, and she seemed to enjoy my company rather than simply tolerate it. When she offered to help with dinner preparations, it felt natural rather than obligatory. But most importantly, I could see how happy Marcus was with her. He wasn't stressed about money, wasn't constantly checking his phone for credit card alerts, wasn't making excuses for purchases or trying to hide expenses. He'd found someone whose idea of a good life matched what he could actually provide, and that alignment had freed him to be generous and thoughtful in ways that didn't require money. They were married 2 years later in a simple ceremony at a local park, followed by a reception at my house. Sarah's family was warm and welcoming, the kind of people who brought homemade dishes to share and stayed late to help with cleanup. The whole celebration cost less than one of Stephanie's spa days, but it was filled with genuine joy and love in a way that no expensive wedding could have bought. Marcus asked me to walk him down the aisle, since Frank wasn't there to do it. As we walked together toward Sarah, who was beaming in a simple dress she'd bought on sale, Marcus squeezed my arm and whispered, "Thank you for not letting me settle for something that wasn't real." I thought about Stephanie sometimes, wondering whether she'd found the happiness she'd been looking for with someone who could afford her lifestyle expectations. According to mutual friends, she'd married her finance boyfriend and was living in an even more expensive neighborhood than the one she'd shared with Marcus. But I also heard that her new husband worked constantly, that they rarely saw each other, and that she complained about feeling lonely despite having all the material comforts she'd wanted. I didn't take any satisfaction in hearing that she might not be completely happy. I mostly just felt grateful that Marcus had escaped a relationship that would have kept him trapped in a cycle of financial stress and family deception for years. Marcus and Sarah bought their first house together 3 years after their wedding, a modest ranch in a neighborhood of young families. They saved for the down payment themselves, qualified for the mortgage based on their combined income alone, and chose a house that fit comfortably within their budget. When they called to tell me about their offer being accepted, both of them were crying with joy. "We did it ourselves, Mom," Marcus said. "We saved the money, we qualified for the loan, we picked a house we can actually afford. It feels incredible." I attended their closing as a guest, not a financial contributor, and watched as they signed papers that made them homeowners without requiring any assistance from family. The house was smaller than the one Marcus had shared with Stephanie, the neighborhood was less prestigious and the finishes were basic rather than luxurious, but it was completely theirs, paid for with money they'd earned and saved, and that ownership was worth more than any granite countertop or stainless steel appliance. Sarah got pregnant 6 months after they moved into their house, and their daughter Emma was born the following spring. I became a grandmother at 78, and discovered that this role was even more fulfilling than I'd imagined it would be. Emma was welcomed into a family that was financially stable, emotionally honest, and built on values that would serve her well throughout her life. When Emma was a year old, Marcus and Sarah asked me if I wanted to set up a college fund for her, not to contribute money they couldn't afford to contribute themselves, but to be part of planning for her future education in a way that was sustainable and responsible. "We want to teach her about saving and planning and living within her means," Sarah explained. "But we also want her to know that family supports each other in healthy ways, that there's a difference between enabling and helping." I was honored to be part of that planning, to help them think through how to provide for Emma's future without creating the kind of dependency that had almost destroyed my relationship with Marcus. We set up a modest monthly contribution plan where all 3 of us added small amounts to Emma's education fund, teaching her from an early age that financial security comes from consistent, responsible planning rather than expecting others to solve your financial problems. As I write this, Emma is 5 years old, and she's already learning to count coins and understand that money comes from work, that things cost different amounts, and that sometimes you have to wait and save before you can buy something you want. She's growing up in a household where financial conversations are open and honest, where living within your means is seen as a strength rather than a limitation. Marcus still calls me every Sunday just like he did before he got married the first time, but now our conversations are about Emma's latest words, about the garden Sarah's planting, about Marcus's promotion at work, about plans for modest family vacations and home improvement projects they're saving for. Money comes up in our conversations, but as one topic among many, not as a source of stress or conflict. I think about Frank often, especially during family gatherings in Marcus and Sarah's living room, watching Emma play with toys while her parents cook dinner together and plan for their future. I think Frank would be proud of the man Marcus became once he found the courage to live according to the values we'd tried to teach him. I think he'd love Sarah's practical wisdom and generous heart, and I think he'd be delighted with Emma's curiosity and the secure, loving home she's growing up in. The money I might have spent continuing to subsidize Marcus and Stephanie's unsustainable lifestyle has instead been used for things that bring me genuine joy. I've traveled with friends from the credit union, taken classes at the community college, and made improvements to my own home that I'd been putting off for years. I've been able to help Emma's college fund grow steadily, and to be present for Marcus's family in ways that are supportive rather than enabling. Most importantly, I've learned the difference between being needed and being valued, between providing financial assistance and buying emotional connection, between helping someone succeed and enabling someone to avoid the consequences of their choices. Sometimes people ask me if I regret stopping the mortgage payments, if I wish I'd handled the situation differently, if I'm sorry that Marcus's first marriage ended. The answer is always no. I regret that it took me 3 years to recognize that I was being taken advantage of, but I don't regret enforcing boundaries once I understood what was happening. Marcus needed to learn how to live within his means, how to build relationships based on honesty rather than financial deception, how to choose partners who shared his values rather than just his resources. If I'd continued enabling his financial irresponsibility, he never would have learned those lessons, and he never would have found the happiness he has now. Stephanie needed to find someone whose resources matched her expectations, and apparently she did. I hope she's genuinely happy with the choices she made, just as I hope she's learned something about the difference between love and financial convenience. And I needed to learn how to distinguish between generous giving and financial manipulation, between family support and family exploitation. I needed to understand that real love requires honest communication and mutual respect, not just financial assistance. The woman who was told she wasn't welcome at Christmas dinner because she wasn't immediate family is now the grandmother who gets to spend every Christmas morning watching Emma open presents under a tree that was bought with money her parents saved themselves. In a house that belongs to them completely, surrounded by love that was earned through honesty and shared values rather than purchased with monthly mortgage payments. That transformation didn't happen because I was vindictive or controlling. It happened because I finally had the courage to require that financial generosity be accompanied by emotional respect, that family support flow both ways, and that the people I helped were committed to eventually helping themselves. Marcus found his way back to the values Frank and I had taught him, but only after he was forced to choose between those values and a lifestyle he couldn't afford. Sarah brought her own wisdom and strength to their relationship, but only after Marcus had learned to be honest about who he really was and what he could realistically provide. Emma is growing up in a family that understands money as a tool for building security and creating opportunities, not as a measure of self-worth or a substitute for genuine accomplishment. She'll face her own financial challenges as she grows up, but she'll face them with parents who model responsibility and honesty rather than entitlement and deception. And I've learned that the most loving thing you can sometimes do for family is to refuse to enable their poor choices, even when that refusal causes temporary pain and conflict. Real family support means helping people become their best selves, not helping them avoid the consequences of being their worst selves. The mortgage payments I canceled led to so much more than just a change in my bank balance. They led to transformations in character, relationships, and values that have enriched all of our lives in ways that money alone never could have accomplished. The years that followed brought changes I never could have anticipated when I first stopped those mortgage payments. What began as a simple decision to stop enabling financial irresponsibility blossomed into a complete transformation of how our family understood money, relationships, and what it truly means to support each other. Emma's 5th birthday party was held in Marcus and Sarah's backyard, a modest celebration that perfectly captured who they'd become as a family. Sarah had made the cake herself, a slightly lopsided princess castle that Emma declared was the most beautiful cake in the world. The decorations were handmade, the games were simple, and the guest list included neighborhood children whose parents had become genuine friends rather than social connections based on income level. I watched Marcus helping Emma blow out her candles, and I was struck by how different he looked compared to the stressed, dishonest man he'd been during his marriage to Stephanie. There was a lightness to him now, a genuine contentment that came from living authentically within his means. He wasn't checking his phone constantly for banking alerts or making mental calculations about whether they could afford upcoming expenses. He was simply present, enjoying his daughter's joy without the underlying anxiety that had characterized his previous life. "Grandma Mattie," Emma said, climbing into my lap after the cake had been served, "Daddy says you used to give people money when they needed help, but now you teach them how to make their own money instead. Is that true?" I looked over at Marcus, who was cleaning up wrapping paper with Sarah, both of them laughing at something one of the other parents had said. Something like that, sweetheart. I learned that the best way to help people is to help them learn how to help themselves. Like when mommy teaches me to tie my shoes instead of just tying them for me. Exactly like that, I said, marveling at how clearly Emma understood concepts that had taken me years to figure out. Later that evening, after the guests had gone home and Emma had fallen asleep surrounded by her new toys, Marcus, Sarah, and I sat on their back porch drinking iced tea and reflecting on how far we'd all come. I got a call from Stephanie last week, Marcus said quietly, and I felt Sarah tense beside him. It was the first time her name had come up in months. Is everything all right? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. She's getting divorced again, Marcus said. Apparently her second husband lost his job in finance, and they can't afford their lifestyle anymore. She wanted to know if I thought you might be willing to help them with their mortgage payments. The audacity of the request was breathtaking, but I found myself feeling more sad than angry. Stephanie had learned nothing from her first marriage's collapse. She was still looking for external solutions to internal problems, still trying to find someone else to subsidize choices she couldn't afford to make. What did you tell her? Sarah asked. I told her that my mother doesn't enable financial irresponsibility anymore, and that she should probably figure out how to live within her means like the rest of us, Marcus said. I also told her that maybe this was an opportunity for her to learn some of the lessons I had to learn when our marriage ended. How did she respond to that? She said I'd become judgmental and cold and that she couldn't believe I'd turn my back on someone who used to be family. Marcus shook his head. Even now, she doesn't understand that living within your means isn't punishment, it's freedom. Do you feel bad about not trying to help her? I asked. Marcus considered this for a moment. I feel sad that she's going through a difficult time, but I don't feel obligated to solve problems that she created by refusing to make responsible choices. And I definitely don't feel like I should ask my mother to enable someone else's financial irresponsibility after everything we went through. Sarah reached over and squeezed Marcus's hand. I'm proud of you for setting that boundary. It would have been easy to feel guilty and get pulled back into that dynamic. I learned from the best, Marcus said, looking at me with a smile. My mother taught me that the most loving thing you can do sometimes is refuse to make things easier for someone who needs to learn how to handle things themselves. This conversation stayed with me for weeks afterward. It reinforced how much growth had occurred, not just in Marcus's financial habits, but in his understanding of healthy relationships and appropriate boundaries. The man who had once taken advantage of my generosity while lying about his circumstances was now confident enough to refuse to enable similar behavior in others. But Stephanie's situation also made me reflect on the broader patterns I'd observed over the years since stopping those mortgage payments. Through my connections at the credit union and conversations with other retired women in my social circles, I'd learned that my experience wasn't unique. Many parents and grandparents were struggling with adult children who expected ongoing financial support while making poor financial decisions. This realization led me to start volunteering with a financial literacy program at the community center, teaching workshops for both young adults and parents about healthy financial boundaries and sustainable money management. The program had been running for 2 years now, and I'd worked with dozens of families who were dealing with variations of the same issues Marcus and I had faced. One of my favorite success stories was Jennifer, a woman in her 50s whose daughter and son-in-law had been living in her basement for 3 years while claiming they were saving money for their own place. In reality, they'd been spending their rent-free situation to finance expensive vacations and luxury purchases while Jennifer paid for groceries, utilities, and household expenses for 4 adults. When Jennifer first came to one of my workshops, she was exhausted and resentful but afraid to set boundaries because she didn't want to abandon her daughter during a difficult transition period. By the end of our 12-week program, she'd given her daughter and son-in-law a 6-month timeline to find their own housing and had stopped subsidizing their lifestyle in any way. The transition was difficult and her daughter accused her of being selfish and unsupportive. But 6 months later, the young couple had found an apartment they could afford, had learned to budget for their own groceries and expenses, and had started making real progress toward financial independence. Jennifer's relationship with her daughter had actually improved once the financial dynamic was removed from the equation. They visit because they want to see me now, Jennifer told the group during our monthly follow-up meeting. Not because they need something from me. And when they come for dinner, they bring dessert or flowers or offer to help with dishes. It feels like a real relationship instead of a transaction. Stories like Jennifer's reinforced my belief that the decision I'd made with Marcus had been not just appropriate but necessary. Enabling financial irresponsibility doesn't just hurt the person providing the money, it actively harms the person receiving it by preventing them from developing the skills and character necessary for genuine independence. But the workshops also taught me about the emotional complexity of these situations. Many of the parents I worked with struggled with guilt about setting financial boundaries, worried that they were being selfish or uncaring. They'd been socialized to believe that good parents always help their children, regardless of the circumstances or consequence. I found myself sharing my story with these groups, explaining how stopping the mortgage payments had ultimately led to Marcus developing financial responsibility, finding a healthier relationship, and building the kind of life that made him genuinely happy. But I also talked about the difficulty of those early months, the uncertainty about whether I was making the right choice, and the sadness that came with watching my son struggle with consequences I could have prevented. The hardest part, I told one particularly emotional workshop group, wasn't stopping the financial support, it was trusting that my son was capable of figuring things out for himself. I'd been solving his problems for so long that I'd forgotten he was actually a competent adult who could handle difficult situations if he had to. These conversations with other families also helped me understand that my situation with Marcus had actually been relatively straightforward, compared to some of the challenges other parents faced. At least Marcus had eventually been willing to acknowledge his mistakes and make change. Some families dealt with adult children who had addiction issues, mental health challenges, or abusive partners that complicated the financial boundary setting process. But even in these more complex situations, the basic principles remained the same. Financial support needed to be tied to genuine progress toward independence, not just temporary relief from consequences. Help needed to be structured in ways that encouraged responsibility rather than dependence, and emotional relationships needed to be separated from financial arrangements so that love wasn't confused with enabling. The community center workshops led to other opportunities to share what I'd learned. I was invited to speak at financial planning seminars for pre-retirees, helping them think through how to structure their estate planning and family financial support in ways that would benefit rather than harm their adult children. One of the most common questions I received was about inheritance planning. Many parents worried about leaving their children money that might undermine their work ethic or financial responsibility. My advice was always to focus on values-based giving rather than just transferring wealth. Instead of leaving your children money with no strings attached, I would tell these groups, consider leaving them money with clear expectations about how it should be used. Match their retirement contributions, help with down payments on modest homes they can afford to maintain, fund education or training that will increase their earning capacity. Give them tools to build wealth rather than just wealth itself. Marcus and Sarah had become wonderful examples of this approach. When Emma was born, I'd established a small trust fund for her education, but it was structured to reward academic achievement and responsible financial behavior rather than just providing automatic payment. Emma would receive increasing amounts of support as she demonstrated her ability to handle money responsibly, with the largest distributions tied to completing her education and making sound financial decisions as a young adult. This approach seemed to work well for all of us. Emma was learning that money came with expectations and responsibilities. Marcus and Sarah were planning for their daughter's future without feeling overwhelmed by the costs, and I was able to support my granddaughter's development in ways that aligned with our family's values. The ripple effects of the changes in our family extended beyond just financial matters. Marcus had become more confident in all areas of his life, not just money management. At work, he'd been promoted twice since his divorce, partly because he was no longer distracted by financial stress and marital conflict. He could focus on his job performance without constantly worrying about whether his paycheck would cover their expenses. Sarah had also flourished in ways that might not have been possible if she'd entered a relationship with someone who was financially irresponsible. Her teaching career had progressed steadily, and she'd recently completed a master's degree that would allow her to move into educational administration. She could pursue her professional goals without worrying that Marcus might accumulate debt or make financial commitments without consulting her. Their marriage was built on a foundation of shared values and mutual respect that made them genuinely good partners for each other. They made financial decisions together, supported each other's goals, and approached challenges as a team. Watching them navigate everything from home repairs to career changes to parenting decisions, I could see how different this relationship was from what Marcus had experienced with Stephanie. "We trust each other completely," Sarah told me during one of our regular coffee dates. "I know Marcus would never make a major financial decision without talking to me first, and he knows I'm committed to our shared goals rather than just my own wants. It makes everything easier when you know you're truly partnering with someone." This partnership approach had also influenced how they were raising Emma. She was learning to see money as a family resource that required cooperation and planning, rather than something that individual family members could claim or spend without considering the impact on everyone else. At 5 years old, Emma already understood that family purchases required discussion and agreement. When she wanted a new toy or book, she knew to ask whether it fit in the family budget and whether it was more important than other things they might need or want. She was learning to delay gratification, to save her allowance for special purchases, and to think about the difference between wants and needs. But perhaps most importantly, Emma was growing up in a household where money was discussed openly and honestly rather than being a source of stress, conflict, or secrecy. She knew how much things cost, understood that her parents worked to earn money, and was beginning to grasp concepts like saving and budgeting that would serve her throughout her life. "We want her to be financially literate from an early age," Marcus explained to me. "Not because we want her to obsess about money, but because we want her to understand it well enough that it never controls her life the way it controlled mine for those years with Stephanie." This commitment to financial education was already paying dividends. Emma was more responsible with her belongings than many children her age, partly because she understood their value and the effort required to replace them. She was also more grateful for experiences and gifts, because she understood they represented choices her parents had made about how to use their resources. The contrast between Emma's financial education and what I now understood about Marcus's upbringing was striking. Frank and I had tried to teach Marcus good values about money, but we'd also shielded him from many of the realities of financial decision-making. We'd wanted to give him a childhood free from money worries, but in doing so, we'd perhaps left him unprepared for the financial challenges of adulthood. Emma, on the other hand, was learning about money in age-appropriate ways that demystified financial management without burdening her with adult concern. She understood that money was finite, that choices had consequences, and that financial security came from making smart decisions rather than hoping someone else would solve your problem. This generational difference gave me hope that Emma would avoid the financial mistakes that had nearly destroyed Marcus's first marriage and damaged our relationship for several years. She was developing the character and skills necessary for genuine financial independence, supported by parents who modeled responsible behavior rather than financial recklessness. As Emma grew older, I looked forward to being part of her continued financial education. I wanted to teach her about compound interest and long-term saving, about the difference between good debt and bad debt, about how to evaluate financial opportunities and avoid financial traps. But most importantly, I wanted to model for her the difference between generous giving and enabling dependence. The woman who had once written mortgage payment checks every month without asking questions had become someone who thought carefully about when financial help was appropriate and when it was harmful. I'd learned to distinguish between emergency assistance and lifestyle subsidization, between temporary support during genuine hardship and ongoing enablement of poor choices. This wisdom had made me a better grandmother, a better friend, and a better community member. I was able to help people in ways that actually helped rather than just making things temporarily easier. I could offer support that built character and capacity rather than creating dependency and resentment. The irony wasn't lost on me that canceling those mortgage payments had ultimately made me a more generous person rather than a less generous one. When I stopped giving money in ways that harmed both the giver and receiver, I freed up resources and energy for giving that actually made a positive difference in people's lives. My volunteer work at the community center had expanded to include mentoring young women who were struggling with financial decisions, serving on the board of a nonprofit that provided financial education to low-income families, and contributing to a scholarship fund for students studying financial planning and counseling. These activities gave me a sense of purpose and fulfillment that simply writing checks had never provided. I was using my experience and resources to help people develop the skills and knowledge they needed to improve their own situations, rather than just temporarily relieving their immediate problem. Marcus had also become involved in financial education efforts, speaking occasionally at workshops for young married couples about the importance of financial honesty in relationships. His story resonated with people who were struggling to balance their desire for a comfortable lifestyle with the reality of their income and debt levels. I thought being a good husband meant giving my wife everything she wanted, he would tell these groups. But I learned that being a good husband means being honest about what we can afford and working together to build something sustainable. The most loving thing I ever did for my marriage was refusing to keep lying about our financial situation. These speaking opportunities had connected Marcus with other men who had struggled with similar issues, creating a support network of people who understood the challenges of choosing financial responsibility over lifestyle expectations. He'd developed friendships based on shared values rather than shared spending patterns, relationships that supported his commitment to living within his means rather than pressuring him to spend beyond them. Sarah had also found community among other mothers who prioritized financial responsibility over material display. Emma's playmates came from families who shared similar values about money and parenting, creating a social environment that reinforced the lessons she was learning at home rather than undermining them. This alignment between family values and social community was something I hadn't fully appreciated during Marcus's marriage to Stephanie. Looking back, I could see how the pressure to keep up with their social circle had contributed to their financial problems and relationship conflict. They'd been surrounded by people whose lifestyle expectations exceeded what Marcus could realistically provide, creating constant pressure to spend money they didn't have. Emma's social world was completely different. Her friends' families made financial decisions based on their actual income rather than their aspirations or social pressure. Birthday parties were modest affairs, playdates involved free activities like park visits and library story times, and parents talked openly about budgeting for family activities rather than pretending money was no object. This environment allowed Emma to develop friendships based on shared interests and genuine compatibility rather than material advantages or lifestyle display. She was learning that relationships should be about enjoying each other's company rather than impressing each other with possessions or experience. As I reflected on all these changes during quiet moments in my own home, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the difficult decision I'd made to stop those mortgage payments. What had seemed like a relationship crisis at the time had actually been the beginning of a transformation that had improved every aspect of our family's life. Marcus was happier, more confident, and more authentic than he'd ever been during his first marriage. Sarah had found a partner who shared her values and supported her goals rather than someone who expected her to subsidize his financial irresponsibility. Emma was growing up with a clear understanding of money and relationships that would serve her throughout her life. And I had learned to be the kind of family member who truly supported the people I loved, rather than just enabling their poor choices. I discovered that real love sometimes required difficult conversations and uncomfortable boundaries, but that the results of those difficult moments were relationships based on honesty and mutual respect rather than financial dependency and resentment. The mortgage payments I'd canceled had been replaced by something much more valuable, a family built on authentic connections, shared values, and genuine care for each other's growth and well-being. We'd all learned that the most generous thing you can do for someone is help them become capable of handling their own challenges, rather than just handling those challenges for them. That lesson had rippled out beyond our immediate family, influencing my volunteer work, my friendships, and my approach to all the relationships in my life. I'd become someone who gave thoughtfully rather than automatically,
who helped in ways that built capacity rather than creating dependence. The woman who had once written checks without asking questions had become someone who asked the right questions before offering any assistance. The transformation had been difficult, but it had led to a life that was more fulfilling, relationships that were more authentic, and a legacy that would benefit my granddaughter for generations to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.